Okay, so this is a little bit of a different video compared to my usual content, but I wanted to take a break from that and talk about the future of Command & Conquer, or at least my thoughts on the future of the franchise. I know a few other channels have talked about this, but I wanted to put my own thoughts out there to add to this topic. So the future of Command & Conquer. Unfortunately, I can't say that I'm all that optimistic about the series, at least when it comes to any official entries from Electronic Arts. Yes, EA has done some positive things for the series over the past few years, the biggest one obviously being the Remastered Collection, which was, well, actually 5 years ago now. And since then, the only thing EA has done with the franchise is add the entire C&C collection on Steam, which was done a year ago now, and also released the source code for some of the classic titles back in February of this year. Of course, let's not forget EA also allowed the creation of Command & Conquer Legions, which was released in 2023, and this really is just a microtransaction-filled mobile game that's wearing the skin of C&C. So while I guess EA is making enough money off Legions to justify its existence, I think such games only serve to hurt C&C's reputation as a whole, driving away original fans while failing to actually attract that many new ones. So I guess the question then is, where exactly does the franchise go from here? I think the obvious answer is that EA should make a Remastered Collection 2, which would consist of Tiberium Sun, Red Alert 2, and their respective expansion packs. All the better if they got Petroglyph Games and perhaps Lemon Sky Studios to return to work on this new collection, as they did a fantastic job with the original. Now, this all seems pretty straightforward, but I have seen rumors that supposedly the source code for Tiberium Sun and Red Alert 2 were lost, which, assuming that's true, means it would be more difficult to develop a second Remastered Collection. Though again, I have no idea how true that rumor is. In fact, I don't even know who started it. Like if it was a fan who knew someone at EA, or if a former Westwood developer said that, I don't know. But even if that's the case, I do think putting in the time and effort to make a Remastered Collection 2 would still be worth it. Especially if it has Red Alert 2, which is the most popular of all the C&C games. So assuming this second Remaster Collection is just as good as the first, I think it would be a big win for the fan base, and for EA as well, who I think really needs some big W's now and in the future. But let's assume that EA does make a Remastered Collection 2, or heck, let's go further and say they end up making remastered versions of all the major C&C titles. Where does the franchise then go from there? See, while I think remastering the mainline C&C games would be a great thing for the fan base, I'm not convinced that that by itself would bring about a full-on revival of the franchise, or generate enough long-term interest in it. If EA wanted that, then they would have to pretty much put in the amount of effort and money that Microsoft put in to revive the Age of Empires franchise, which I think is something that is just too risky for EA to commit to, and frankly not without reason. If we look at other well-established RTS franchises that made sequels, the results haven't been great. Homeworld 3, for example, ended up doing very poorly. Largely, it seems because of the story. Company of Heroes 3 ended up having a mixed reception, and even though it's apparently gotten better since its release, how many people are really going to go back and give it a second chance? Then there's Age of Empires 4, which, while being a successful new entry in the Age of Empires franchise, gets upstaged by the definitive edition of Age of Empires 2. Speaking of which, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition is the one classic RTS game that manages to consistently maintain a spot in Steam's top 100 most played games list, something that no other classic RTS has been able to do. So while there has certainly been this effort by other companies to revitalize the RTS genre using classic franchises, the overall results are a mixed bag, which I think certainly contributes to EA's hesitancy over ever developing a new mainline C&C title. The simple reality is that the RTS genre just isn't as popular as it was during the late 90s and early 2000s, and I don't think it's going to reach that level of popularity ever again. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible to make a good or even profitable RTS game, but I just don't think it's going to bring in the big bucks that companies like EA want, which is what their primary business model is based around. But okay, let's say EA was interested in making a new, proper C&C game, or at the very least outsourcing the project to a developer like Petroglyph. The question then is, which of the existing timelines would this new game take place in? Well, they could just begin with a clean slate, featuring a completely new setting unassociated with the previous entries. Though that would mean EA would have to spend a lot of money just on marketing the game. I also think there would be many in the fanbase who may not even give the game a chance if it isn't associated with any of the already existing timelines. So with that in mind, I think the easiest and safest route to go would be to make a Red Alert 4. The Red Alert games were always the most popular ones in the series, and the narrative setup for a fourth game would be pretty simple. Just say that Future Tech, or one of the other factions from Red Alert 3, created a time machine and used it to alter history again, creating a new timeline with the traditional factions of the Allies and Soviets, while introducing a new third faction into the mix. Something like that. From there, as long as they have campaigns for each faction, while keeping the story and humor on par with Red Alert 3's, they should be good. Gameplay-wise, I do think it would be better to orient the game more towards Kane's Wrath, where there was less of an emphasis on every unit having some kind of secondary ability. Personally, that was probably the biggest aspect of RA3's gameplay I didn't like, and I felt that developers only did that to try and appeal to highly competitive esport players, which was something that ultimately didn't work out for the game. That's something that really should be emphasized here. Any new C&C game should be primarily focused on the single-player component, which is the campaigns, and have plenty of maps for skirmish mode. It's fine to have multiplayer with proper ranked ladder support, custom games, and all that, but trying to deliberately create the next big esport RTS game is just not gonna work. All the other RTS games in the past that did that failed. So it would be a shame to see them, or any developer creating an RTS, make that same mistake. I do think they could have a co-op mode that either lets two players play the campaign together, or even have a co-op Generals Challenge mode, which I could also see being a popular addition. Now what about the other timelines, Generals and Tiberium? For Generals, you might as well just do a reboot or remake of the original. I mean, the story of Generals never was as fleshed out as the Tiberium games, nor did it have the humor of the Red Alerts. Though it did have some of the best unit quotes in the series. Plus Generals Challenge, which is one of my favorite game modes, and is the main reason why I return to play Zero Hour every so often. Though as I mentioned previously, you could just add that kind of mode to a new Red Alert or Tiberium themed game. I know that Red Alert 3 has Commander's Challenge, but I don't think it's as good compared to the original mode in Zero Hour. In fact, you could probably just make an entire game revolving around the General's Challenge mode. So don't even have a separate story campaign. The General's Challenge is the campaign. That would definitely give the game a lot of replay potential, and you could always add new generals to play as or against. Though EA would probably lock any new generals behind a paywall of microtransactions, which would anger most people. Another issue I think is worth mentioning regarding another Generals game is that I don't think it would be as politically incorrect as the original. which I think would take away some of the, what I'll just call charm the original game had.
I love a crowd!
I mean, even the beta gameplay that I've seen from Generals 2 seemed to have cut a lot of that back on its own. I know that kind of dampened my excitement for Generals 2 at the time, so I guess I was in the minority and not being upset that the game was cancelled. Overall, I think a new Generals game would be difficult to pull off without abandoning what made the original Generals special to the subset of the C&C fandom that enjoys that game. So that brings us to Tiberium, which is my favorite timeline of the series. Okay, so unsurprisingly, I think what most people want from a new C&C title set in the Tiberium universe is a complete remake of Command & Conquer 4. So, how would this work? Step 1. Officially decanonize Tiberium Twilight. Basically just say it's an alternate timeline of events that is no longer canon. Maybe even make it so that the bad ending of the GDI campaign from C&C 3 leads to Tiberium Twilight. But this new game is taking place after the events of the good ending of the GDI campaign. Shout out to a channel called Sven Vanderplank for that idea. Step 2. This new C&C 4, so to speak, is a classic RTS game with none of the MOBA elements. Pretty much make the gameplay similar to Kane's Wrath, where you construct an actual base and have to gather most of your Tiberium from actual Tiberium fields instead of some TCN node. Step 3, which is most important, provide a well-written story for the campaigns, which take place from all the perspectives of the major factions in the game, including the Skrin, because, yes, the Skrin invasion has to be depicted in-game. Also, no side plots that have nothing to do with the primary focus of the story. I think it would be best to have all the campaigns happening around the same time of each other, or at the very least, make sure they are all canonical and contribute to the final conclusion of the game, which respects the Tiberium series as a whole. All this combined leads to Step 4, Profit. I mean, this is such an easy win for EA, right? Just a totally flawless plan, so much so it's shocking that EA hasn't already done it. Well, for the longest time, that's certainly what I thought, but I gotta give credit to a channel called Zaid and his own Future of Command & Conquer video for bringing up a very critical point, which is this. Would Joe Kukan be willing to reprise his role as Kane one last time? I mean, it's possible, but from my understanding, Tiberium Twilight really was the last time Joe was going to play the character. And other than doing some short cameos as Kane like he did for the Remastered Collection, I'm not sure he would be willing to reprise the role again for a full game, even if it were to be the proper conclusion to the series. Some people may be tempted to say that they should just get someone else to do the role then, or that the game shouldn't even bother with the live-action mission briefings at all, but then EA would just be once again angering the fanbase by doing so. And that is the absolute last thing EA should be doing at this point. So, in my opinion, unless Joe Kukan reprises his role as Kane, I just don't think it's worth even doing a C&C 4 remake. And really, that calls into question whether it's worth even doing any new mainline C&C game in the Tiberium timeline. I could certainly see a scenario where you could have a Tiberium game that takes place after Tiberium Twilight. So let's say Kane and his loyal followers all ascended to wherever. The actual location doesn't matter, it's intentionally left unexplained to be a mystery. But it wasn't the Skrin homeworld. But this ascension causes the Skrin to do their belated second invasion of Earth, so the game ends up being GDI versus the Skrin and some third faction that isn't the Brotherhood of Nod. Or maybe it is the Brotherhood of Nod, but it's a new version of the faction, I guess. Either way, I don't think many fans would accept a Brotherhood that isn't led by Kane. And you can't have Kane unless you have Joe Kukan filling the role. I mean, at that point, is it even a true Tiberium game without the original Brotherhood of Nod? I can imagine many fans saying no. So I think it would be really difficult to make a new Tiberium game without Kane that wouldn't cause some sort of outrage or disappointment within the fan base. At least, it would be difficult if the game was trying to be an RTS. This brings me to another related subject I've been thinking about, which is, could you make a brand new Command & Conquer game that isn't an RTS? Now, some might say that doing such a thing would be straying too far away from the franchise's roots, and I think there's certainly truth to that perspective, but just bear with me on this. First off, Command & Conquer Renegade exists, and that's an FPS game in the C&C universe. Now, despite Renegade performing poorly financially at the time of its release, it has gained a reputation of being a cult classic, and it did set the precedent for a mainline C&C game that wasn't an RTS. There was also the squad-focused FPS game called Tiberium that was revealed in 2008, and at that time it seemed like a lot of C&C fans, including myself, were pretty optimistic about the game, even though it wasn't an RTS. Of course, we don't know just how well the game would have been received on release, since development was cancelled, I believe that same year, but I do remember a lot of fans being upset by the cancellation. So this makes me wonder, maybe fans of the series are actually more open to a non-RTS Command & Conquer game, so long as it's not a mobile cash grab game, of course. So if EA are not convinced in developing a new RTS C&C game, then perhaps they could consider an FPS like Renegade, or revive the concept of a squad-focused FPS like Tiberium. Heck, a new Vegas-styled RPG in the Tiberium universe? You wouldn't even have to set the game as a sequel to Tiberium Twilight either. You could have it set at some other point in the Tiberium timeline. And since it's not an RTS, there isn't really an expectation to have live-action mission briefings. Going back to Renegade, that game had none of those, though it did still have Kane being voiced by Joku Khan. But if the new game has, I guess, a tighter, more localized focus, then I don't think you really need to have any of the traditional high-profile characters in it. In addition, I think having a non-RTS C&C could potentially see more success with attracting new people to the franchise, allowing it to actually grow, which would generate more revenue and thus justify actively creating additional mainline games. In fact, this was something that was successfully achieved with Fallout 3 back when it released in 2008, and since then, Fallout has become the biggest post-apocalyptic game franchise. Of course, that required Fallout to move away from certain aspects of the original entries, the most consequential, I think, being that Fallout games are no longer CRPGs. This may be blasphemy for me to consider, but perhaps that's the only way the C&C franchise could be truly revived and be able to thrive in the long term, is having to shift away from its RTS roots, while at the same time still remaining true to its core identity as a franchise. Then again, that was already tried with Tiberium Twilight and it didn't work out at all. Though how much of that is due to Tiberium Twilight's poor writing compared to the actual gameplay, I think is a little more difficult to determine. So perhaps it isn't possible for the franchise to move away from RTS, which means it will continue to exist in its current state, slowly fading away with the passage of time. But maybe that's okay? I mean, not everything lasts forever, right? Sure, Fallout may be the biggest post-apocalyptic gaming franchise right now, but with time, it too will decline and probably get replaced with something else. Same thing with other franchises like Warcraft or Star Wars. Eventually, all these franchises will succumb to the passage of time, no matter how much the owners and fans of the franchise try to prevent it. And even if they do manage to keep them going, what's the cost of that? And I'm not talking about monetary costs, which are a factor, of course. I'm more referring to the cost of that franchise's identity, and what it represents in the minds of its audience and fans. It seems to me that the longer a franchise is kept alive past its prime, the more its identity becomes diluted, so much so that it eventually becomes something else entirely. At that point, the only original aspect of the franchise that still exists is the name, which means nothing if the franchise's actual content has changed. Heck, you could probably make the argument that Command & Conquer reached that point a long time ago with Tiberium Twilight, and that games such as Rivals and Legion have only compounded the problem, which means it's just best to leave the franchise as is and not try to do anything new with it for fear of potentially further diluting its core identity. Anyway, I feel like I've rambled on enough with this topic. In summary, the future of C&C is probably just getting remasters of the old games every few years from EA, since that's probably the safest, most profitable thing they'd want to do. I think the community will try to make up for that by creating its own unofficial content in the form of large mods like Tiberium Insurrection, General's Evolution, and others. This will certainly keep those of us original fans who are still around entertained, but unfortunately, I just don't think any of this will be enough to truly revitalize the franchise, which would take, at minimum, an Age of Empires revival level of effort, something that I don't think EA has the will to attempt. So I know this video was kind of all over the place at times, since these are my own personal musings I've had regarding the C&C franchise, but let me know what you guys think in the comments, as I'd really like to hear others' opinions on the franchise's future, how it could be revitalized, what would that look like, or if you think it's best to leave it alone as is. I appreciate everyone taking the time to watch the video, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one.